Enemy at the Gates and the Call of Duty Soviet campaign are probably best known for their depiction of the charge on Red Square. Both show men sharing rifles and low on ammunition, charging fixed German positions without support weapons, and being mercilessly slaughtered. In the game, before the charge, commissars are shown mass machine gunning men who are retreating from a previous attack, while the film shows men retreating after failing to take the square and then being gunned down by the commissars, leaving no men alive. There is a lot to unpack here, but this video is going to focus on the myths and realities of blocking detachments and Soviet attacks, and what actually happened with the 13th Guards Division and the 284th Rifle Division. Part 1. Not one step backwards. This phrase, and the idea of using force to spur men forward, is based on Order 227. Decreed by Stalin on July 28, 1942, it was commonly called the Not One Step Back Order. In response to Soviet retreats in the face of the German Case Blue onslaught, it called for execution or sentencing to penal battalions, or Strafbati, for those accused of cowardice, panic-mongering, or unauthorized retreat. The Soviets had retreated so far in the summer of 1942 that Stalin believed that these harsh measures were needed to reinstill discipline and stop the panic. The order stated that some unwise people at the front comfort themselves with arguments that we can continue the retreat to the east as we have vast territories, a lot of soil, many people, and that we will always have abundance of bread. Every commander, every soldier, and political officer have to realize that our resources are not infinite. If we do not stop retreating, we will be left without bread, without fuel, without metals, without raw materials, without factories and plants, without railroads. The conclusion is that it is time to stop the retreat, not a single step back. This should be our slogan from now on. One veteran, Tamara Kalmakova, argued that this was necessary, stating, "Everybody was retreating, and that was why the not a step back order was so badly needed. Because lots of people, soldiers and commanders, seemed to think that as we had so much land, our country was so large, we could keep retreating and retreating, and then, at some future date, start fighting properly again when everyone had a decent weapon and training. But that just wasn't right, because we were leaving behind so much, our harvests, our factories and our plants, our people. We couldn't keep falling back, and Stalin, in his Order 227, realized this. The order was vital to restore discipline in the army and alleviate the despondency felt by the people. In order to help enforce Order 227, it called for the creation of blocking detachments, or Ultryady Zagrashchenie, to prevent desertion and to keep men fighting. Their actual use, though, is somewhat debated. Richard Overy claims that, in practice, these new units found themselves carrying out menial tasks or guard duty in the rear when they were desperately needed by a fresh order. By the end of the war, Overy claims that 442,000 men were forced into the penal battalions under this order, with an additional 438,000 men in prison. Penal battalions were said to be able to redeem themselves through blood, and clearing minefields or attacking German strongpoints head-on was not an uncommon task for them. It is hard to know how many men were executed, but Russian estimates after the war put the number at around 158,000 for the entirety of the conflict. For Stalingrad, the number is controversial. Antony Beevor claims that 13,500 men were killed directly under Chuikov, while Michael K. Jones argues that this number was for the whole Stalingrad front, combining all of Yeremenko's men throughout the whole campaign. Anatoly Kozlov, one veteran, disputes this number, stating, "Let us be frank, 13,500 men is the equivalent of a new full-strength division, and we didn't see many of those in our fighting for the city." Using one NKVD report, Michael Jones argues that during the September crisis, 1,218 soldiers were held for attempting to leave the city without permission. Of those, 21 were shot and 10 were arrested and sent to different units. The report blamed the 399th Rifle Division and mentioned that the commander, Major Zhukov, no relation to the marshal, and the commissar, Senior Politruk Raspopov, were killed in front of the ranks to make an example of them. A different report from September 19th to 20th, when the film claims to take place, says that 184 men were detained, 21 were shot, including 7 for spying, 5 as traitors to the motherland, 2 for self-mutilation, 6 for cowardice and panic, and 1 for desertion. 40 were arrested, and the other detainees were sent back to their units. Even if the numbers are controversial, blocking detachments did exist, men were aware of them, and men were arrested and killed throughout the Battle of Stalingrad. Even so, we must be careful in depicting this as the primary motivator for why the Soviet men themselves actually fought. Overy argues that portraying the Soviets as motivated more by fear of the commissars than duty isn't the full picture. Yet the impact of Order 227 can be exaggerated. It was primarily aimed at officers and political commissars, not the rank and file, which had always been subject to harsh discipline. He goes on to reflect that not every soldier stood with a gun to his back, not every instance of self-sacrifice and courageous defiance was a product of coercion or fear. To believe this diminishes the exceptional heroism of thousands of ordinary Soviet men and women whose voluntary commitment to the Soviet cause can scarcely be in doubt. Anatoly Mereshko, a veteran of Chuikov's command staff, echoed this sentiment, stating, "The not-a-step-back order has created a negative image in the West, but also in our own press, of Russian troops being forced to attack with machine guns at their backs." Veteran Vladimir Turov similarly said, "Blocking detachments could not make Order 227 work. The motivation had to be within us." Both the film and game do clearly show that commissars were mass machine gunning men and that it comes off as the primary motivation for the attack. The closest account to the way the film depicts this wasn't based on a failed attack, but rather the sort of unauthorized withdrawal from a fixed position mentioned in the order itself. During the fighting on September 14th, the 399th Rifle Division fell back without orders, and a Soviet report noted that the head of the blocking detachment, Junior Lieutenant of State Security Elman, ordered his detachment to open fire over the head of those retreating. As a result, the personnel of these regiments were halted, and within 2 hours the regiment had occupied their previous defensive positions. So it isn't impossible that the events of the film and game happened, but the closest event from September was the blocking detachments firing over the heads of the men, and not mass machine gunning them down. Discipline was re-established, and the earlier numbers show that while the commissar and commander were shot, along with a small number of men, most of those arrested were sent back to their original positions. Overall, the retreat of the 399th Rifle Division and the use of blocking detachments in the film have multiple points of departure. The 399th Rifle Division was leaving a fixed position, while the men in the film and the game were retreating from a failed attack. For the Rifle Division, the blocking detachments fired above the heads of the men and successfully stopped their retreat, while the film and the game show them gunning down every last survivor and the attack failing. The commissar and the commander of the division were the main targets in the real retreat event, with only 19 rank-and-file men killed as examples, while the film and game show more men than that dying in a mass machine gunning. Finally, the blocking detachment worked and did re-establish order in the case of the 399th Rifle Division, while the blocking detachments in the film and game killed the men and didn't really accomplish any military objectives. While already being conscious of the fact that the film and game have mixed up dates and units involved, we can see that it isn't likely that the men were just killed by the commissars in masses like this, but rather sent back to get killed in the fighting for military objectives. It was no less harsh, but once again we want to be careful of painting the Red Army as motivated only by fear. Number 2, the man with the rifle shoots. By September 14th, the Germans had pushed into Red Square and the surrounding buildings, and when the 13th Guards arrived from September 14th to 15th, they did fight the Germans around there. So while Red Square was the focus point for the 13th Guards, the game and film are playing fast and loose with units, dates, and the sites of battle. Fighting was fierce around Railroad Station No. 1 in Red Square, with the Soviets' own records reporting that they were suffering heavy losses, and the square itself did change hands multiple times. With the 13th Guards, the first and most obvious point is that the men depicted on film should be armed. According to Antony Beevor, Chuikov left Rodimtsev in no doubt about the danger of the position. He had just deployed his very last reserve, the 19 tanks left from an armored brigade. He advised Rodimtsev to leave all heavy equipment behind. His men needed just personal weapons, machine guns, and anti-tank rifles, and as many grenades as they could carry. This means that the men may not have had time to bring over heavy support weapons, but certainly were told to bring rifles, grenades, and light support. The 13th Guards did report having a weapons shortage for up to 10% of their men, but these men were armed before moving into the city, partially explaining why the Guardsmen spent the night of September 14th and into the morning of September 15th, ferrying over their men as quickly as they could be armed and transported. The only account of rifle sharing in the city itself was before September 14th in the northern suburbs of the city and was a militia unit scrambling to prepare for the 16th Panzer Division. This was nowhere near the Guardsmen, and even with the film and game garbling units, it's not representative of what they experienced. In addition, we must note that they were explicitly ordered to support units already in the city, including Chuikov's reserve. This meant they had a brigade of KV tanks and anti-air batteries. While the Guardsmen didn't bring over heavy weapons, they would have been supporting units with more firepower. That said, the film is about Soviet sniper Vassili Zaitsev. His unit, Batyuk's 284th Rifle Division, was sent over the Volga from September 21st to 23rd. The film claims the crossing was on September 20th during the daylight, so again, it's clear that the unit's places and dates are mixed up. Batyuk's division did have a lack of rifles, and in fact only 1/3 of the men had enough to go over and fight on September 21st, but that was the only regiment sent over on that first day, and they were sent to Mamayev Kurgan in the Krutoy Ravine, not Red Square. The other units were sent piecemeal over the next 2 days. David Glantz does state that even though it was short of rifles, Chuikov threw it into combat almost immediately in the sector of Mamayev Kurgan, southward to the Krutoy Ravine. By the 22nd of September, the 1045th and 1047th regiments of the division went over, and they were successfully able to clear their sector of the Volga embankment, and they had artillery support. It's clear that while some men in the division overall did not have rifles at the very beginning, these were not the men actively used in the front lines, but rather the division tried to use what they could while they armed the other ones at the rear. Either way, whatever the film and game were trying to portray, having one rifle and one clip of ammunition per every 2 men is a far cry from the situation in Stalingrad, even at its most dire. Now that we know that the units on screen and in game should have been better armed and not gunned down by commissars, is it feasible that they would charge entrenched Germans with no regard to their own safety, whether at Red Square or elsewhere? Part 3. Zarodiniu za Stalina. Ura! Soviet infantry attacks were complicated. In 1941 and 1942, they were plagued by many issues. One was a lack of competent officers. Between the purges of 1937 and 1938, plus the massive expansion of the Red Army leading up to 1941, 75% of officers entered the war against the Germans with less than a year of experience. By 1942 and the onset of Fall Blau, Soviet officers frequently had 10 years less experience than their German counterparts, especially with armored warfare. Command and control was also rough for the Soviets. For tank units, the Soviets responded by breaking up their mechanized corps from 1941 into smaller tank brigades to make it easier for commanders to field these units. To make matters worse, Soviet communication was frequently done by wire, which was easily cut by artillery and needed to be moved if a headquarters moved. A lack of radios for infantry and tanks meant that even if commanders were capable, then they would have issues transmitting orders in a timely manner. Training could also be a problem, but the Soviets had been working to improve it leading up to the Battle of Stalingrad. In the post-purge Red Army, politics and political commissars had gained more power, and political training was a larger part of men's time than it should have been. That said, with the disgrace of Commissar Lev Meklis upon losing the Crimean Peninsula, this was starting to change by Stalingrad. During the Winter War against Finland, an NKVD report did note that a higher emphasis needed to be placed upon training men to go to ground during attacks, showing that up until that point, this was a deficiency. Even as training improved, there were other issues. Leading into Stalingrad, so many troops were lost in Crimea, the Second Kharkov, and the battles on the Don River that training had to be greatly expedited for reserve armies at times. One veteran put it simply, "Just 3 months, they taught us fast. And what was there for us to complain about? They taught us, they sent us, they killed us." The Soviets did try and improve the officer training situation as they went, though. On December 9, 1941, during the winter counteroffensive, Marshal Georgy Zhukov got sick of commanders throwing men at the enemy without creativity and adhering to predictable tactics. In response, he laid out a series of directives that forbade frontal assaults, asking commanders instead to use cover, ravines, and probing attacks to try and find German flanks or rear areas. He commanded his officers to use superior forces, preferably shock armies, and to outnumber the enemy at the point of any attack. He also directed artillery to be massed at attack sites, and did explicitly say that artillery should be used before and during an attack to soften up enemy defenses and to support advancing men and tanks. Now, this doesn't always mean that struggling Soviet commanders listened. Though this was during the battles of July and August of 1942, Anatoly Mereshko described the situation of the summer, explaining that, "Our counterattacks were hopeless. We would be told to attack after 50 minutes of shelling and an airstrike, but there wouldn't be any shelling, and, no matter how long we waited, our aviation never appeared. A red flare rocket would go up, the signal for attack, but there had been no preparation and the enemy positions would be completely intact. We would fix bayonets, run 300 meters, then the Germans would open fire with everything they had got and we would be forced back to our starting positions. We felt such desperation and anger. We were so disorganized. Time and again we wondered of our high command, why don't they help us fight the enemy properly?" This was before the events of Stalingrad, but it shows that even after Zhukov's orders, some commanders still struggled with organization and coordination of infantry attacks, leading to higher than necessary casualties. A mechanized counterattack that same summer was recorded in Soviet documentation as not smoothly controlled, the attack axes were not refined on the ground, and an artillery preparation was not organized. So while it isn't impossible that commanders defaulted to clumsy frontal assaults, it wasn't drilled in Soviet doctrine, and the Soviets had been trying to improve it. Even more importantly, in the actual Battle of Stalingrad, the 13th Guards successfully held the Volga embankment on September 14th, and they took the Rail Station 1 and mill building that first night. By September 26th, they, along with supporting units, had successfully captured the party buildings around Red Square as well. Bachuk's 284th Division was similarly successful in its attempt to hold the embankment and reinforce Mamayev-Kurgan. Whatever division the film and the game are trying to portray, the fact is that the men should have been shown as having success and not dying for no gain, whether it was to commissars or Germans. On top of the spirit of the battle, the fact is, the film and the game get so many minor dates, events, and units wrong that it is hard to parse what they're even trying to portray. Part 4, Conclusions. Enemy at the Gates and Call of Duty may be compelling dramas, but this first charge at best draws accounts from all over the war and mixes them together, and at worst just gets basic facts wrong. While Order 227 existed along with blocking detachments, and while they did kill up to 158,000 men by one estimate, documentation shows that it was very unlikely that they would just gun down their own men in huge numbers, especially when breaking off a failed attack rather than running away from a fixed position. Not only that, but the charge depicts men sharing rifles, which wasn't true for Vassili Zaitsev's actual unit, and wasn't true for the 13th Guards, which the film might have been trying to invoke. It paints the Soviets as harsh, which is true, but also motivated more by fear than by heroism, which many veterans and authors point out is a dangerous myth. There are accounts of rifle sharing and men picking up rifles off dead comrades, men using improvised weapons, men being thrown into a fight with no training, but they are usually from other points in time or place in the war and not Stalingrad. Many are based on the Narodnoye Opolchenie, or People's Militia. If you want to know about their experiences, you can watch this video that I've done about them, but to say that it was the norm for the regular Red Army, especially in late 1942 and at Stalingrad, to share weapons and charge like this, is at best a stretch and at worst a fabrication. If this level of desperation brutality was the story the filmmaker and game wanted to tell, I wonder why they didn't just show something about the militia rather than about Zaitsev and Stalingrad. Thank you everyone for watching. I know this one was a doozy. If you have any comments, accounts, or useful information, please let me know, as it is hard to respond to a film and game that play fast and loose with dates, units, and places like this. Next time, I'll finally get to Zaitsev himself and how much his story lines up with the film and game. Also, part 3 of the documentary is on the way, I promise. Thank you all again, and stay excited about history.